10,000 BCE, the vast, undulating grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. Long before the first silk thread was spun in a Chinese workshop, and long before the Roman legions marched toward the Euphrates, there was the wind. It is a wind that sweeps across a sea of grass stretching from the borders of modern-day Hungary all the way to the edges of Manchuria. This is not a landscape of cities or monuments, but a realm of motion. To understand the Silk Road, we must first dispel the myth that it began as a planned highway for merchants. It did not begin with a contract or a map. It began with the hoofbeat. In the deep prehistory of Central Asia, the world was defined by the rhythm of migration. The early inhabitants of the steppe were not settled farmers but nomads, highly mobile, incredibly resilient, and intimately tied to the seasonal cycles of the earth. They followed the grass, and the grass followed the rain. These people lived in a world of constant movement, driving herds of cattle, sheep, and eventually the most transformative animal in human history, the horse. As these nomadic tribes moved across the vast corridors of the steppe, they inadvertently created the world's first high-speed transit network. They were the original connective tissue of Eurasia. As they migrated in search of better grazing lands, they carried more than just livestock. They carried ideas, technologies, and the very seeds of connectivity. Imagine a small band of travelers moving through the tall grass. They are not looking to build an empire, but they are looking to survive. To survive, they must exchange. A tribe in the West might possess fine flint tools or unique pottery. A tribe in the East might have mastered the domestication of a specific breed of horse or possessed early forms of metallurgy. These small, localized exchanges, driven by necessity and seasonal movement, formed the primitive, pulsing veins of what would eventually become a global artery. This was the era of the steppe paths. Unlike the later oasis routes, which were dictated by the harsh boundaries of deserts and the availability of water holes, the steppe paths were defined by openness. They were corridors of incredible speed and immense danger. To travel these paths was to exist in a state of constant flux, where the horizon was your only landmark and the weather was your only master. During this prehistoric era, we see the first evidence of long-distance contact. Archaeological finds of obsidian and specific types of stone tools suggest that even thousands of years ago, materials were traveling hundreds, perhaps even thousands of miles from their source. These weren't organized caravans, but rather a relay system, a slow, generational handoff of goods from one nomadic group to the next. The steppe was the crucible. It was here that the horse was mastered, providing the mobility that would eventually allow humans to bridge the massive gap between the sedentary civilizations of the East and the West. The nomads were the pioneers of distance. They bridged the gaps between the mountains and the deserts, turning a fragmented world into a connected one. Before the silk, before the gold, and before the great empires, there was the steppe. And on these windswept paths, the foundation of the world's greatest trade network was being laid, one hoofbeat at a time. 3000 BCE. The rugged, snow-capped peaks of the Kunlun Mountains and the river valleys of the Tarim Basin. If the steppe was the realm of motion, then the mountains were the realm of the sacred. As the nomadic tribes mastered the rhythm of the grasslands, a new, more precious desire was beginning to stir in the hearts of the early settlements of the East. It was not a desire for fabric or for spice, but for something far more elemental, something that possessed the coolness of water and the glow of the moon. This is the story of the Jade Road. Long before the word Silk Road would ever be uttered. A vital artery of human connection was already pulsing through the corridors of Central Asia. But this route was not driven by the pursuit of profit in the way we moderns understand it. It was driven by the pursuit of the divine. In the early dynasties of China, jade was not merely a stone. It was a bridge between the earthly and the celestial. It was believed to possess a life force, a spiritual essence that could protect the soul and signify the very mandate of heaven. To possess jade was to possess virtue, immortality, and status. But there was a problem. The finest, most ethereal jade, the nephrite that the emperors and shamans craved, was not found in the fertile valleys of the Yellow River. It was hidden deep within the frozen, inhospitable reaches of the Cotton Rivers and the treacherous mountain passes of the West. To obtain it, humanity had to do something extraordinary. They had to conquer the geography of the impossible. The Jade Road was the precursor to everything that followed. It was a grueling, vertical network of paths that bypassed the open steppe and instead clung to the edges of the world's most formidable deserts and highest mountains. These were not the wide, sweeping corridors of the nomads, but narrow, perilous tracks that required immense courage and specialized knowledge. The movement of jade necessitated a new kind of human interaction. It required the mountain dwellers to meet the valley farmers. It required the development of specialized transport, not just for the horse, but for the heavy, precious stones that had to be carried through riverbeds and over high-altitude passes. As these stones moved from the western riverbeds toward the eastern heartlands, they acted as a slow-motion catalyst for civilization. Along these routes, the first permanent way stations began to take root. Small settlements emerged, not as bustling commercial hubs, but as essential survival points where travelers could find water and rest. These tiny dots of humanity in a vast, unforgiving landscape were the ancestors of the great oasis cities like Kashgar and Dunhuang. The Jade Road proved that humanity was willing to endure extreme hardship for the sake of something they valued beyond survival. It established the fundamental logic of all future trade. That value creates distance, and distance creates the need for connection. By the time the first silk threads began to move, the paths had already been worn into the earth. The routes had been scouted, the mountains had been mapped by necessity, and the concept of long-distance, high-value exchange had been etched into the human psyche. The foundation was no longer just about moving livestock across grass. It was about moving the sacred across the world. The veins of Eurasia were being laid, not just with hoofbeats, but with the weight of precious stone. 200 BCE. The fertile plains of the Wei River Valley and the sun-drenched hills of the Mediterranean basin. If the Jade Road was a slow, spiritual pulse through the mountains, the world was about to experience a sudden, violent acceleration. The era of small-scale, ritualistic exchange was ending. A new force was emerging, not just of traders and shamans, but of conquerors, bureaucrats, and emperors. The era of the great empires had arrived, and with them, the Silk Road would transform from a collection of wandering paths into a sophisticated, state-sponsored artery of global power. To the east, the chaos of the warring states had finally been silenced by the iron will of the Han dynasty. This was not merely a new kingdom. It was a massive, centralized machine. The Han emperors had unified a fractured landscape, creating a standardized system of weights, measures, and currency. They possessed a hunger for expansion that required more than just land. It required resources, allies, and prestige. For the Han, the vast territories to the west were no longer just mysterious voids. They were strategic frontiers. The strength of the empire depended on its ability to project power beyond the Great Wall, and that power required a way to reach out and touch the unknown. Simultaneously, on the opposite end of the known world, a different kind of titan was rising. In the West, the Roman Republic had matured into the Roman Empire. From the shores of Britain to the sands of Egypt, the Roman eagle was spreading its wings. The Romans were a people of law, engineering, and an insatiable appetite for luxury. As their legions secured the Mediterranean, a new class of wealthy citizens emerged, a class that demanded the exotic, the rare, and the beautiful to signal their status. These two massive, centrifugal forces, the Han in the east and the Romans in the west, were moving toward one another, though neither yet knew the other truly existed. They were like two great tectonic plates, shifting across the vast expanse of Eurasia, creating a tension that would eventually reshape the world. But between these two giants lay the middle ground, a complex tapestry of Central Asian kingdoms, nomadic confederations, and mountain tribes. For these smaller powers, the rise of the great empires was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the sheer scale of imperial demand meant that trade would never again be a trickle, it would become a flood. The demand for silk in Rome, and the demand for horses and precious metals in China, created a vacuum that pulled the entire continent into a single, interconnected economic system. On the other hand, the rise of empires meant that trade was no longer just about the merchant's courage. It was about the emperor's ambition. The routes were now subject to the whims of taxation, the protection of garrisons, and the devastating impact of imperial wars. The Silk Road was being codified. It was being paved with the blood of soldiers and the gold of treasuries. The paths were no longer just tracks through the sand. They were the strategic lifelines of the world's most powerful men. The stage was set, the actors were ready, and the great engine of global history was about to roar to life. 138 BCE. The imperial capital of Chang'an, the beating heart of the Han dynasty. While the empire grew in wealth and stability, it faced a shadow that threatened its very existence, the Xiongnu. These nomadic warriors of the northern steppes were a relentless force, a whirlwind of horsemen who raided Han borders with impunity. For Emperor Wu, the problem was not merely military, it was tactical. The Han possessed vast armies, but they lacked the one thing that could truly neutralize the nomadic threat: superior cavalry. They needed the heavenly horses, large, powerful steeds from the Fergana Valley that were said to sweat blood and possessed a stamina unmatched by any local breed. But how do you find a legendary horse in a world where the West is a void of myth and legend? Enter Zhang Qian. He was not a merchant seeking profit, nor was he a general seeking glory. He was a diplomat, a man of intellect and iron resolve, chosen by Emperor Wu for a mission that bordered on the suicidal. His objective was simple in theory but impossible in practice: travel into the unknown, find allies against the Xiongnu, and secure the trade routes to the west. When Zhang Qian departed from the gates of Chang'an, he was not merely crossing a border, he was stepping off the edge of the known world. He led a small retinue into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Gobi Desert and the Taklamakan. But the mission went sideways almost immediately. The Xiongnu, aware of the emperor's intent, intercepted his party. Zhang Qian was captured. For the next 10 years, Zhang Qian was a prisoner. He lived among the very enemies he was sent to combat, held in a state of perpetual captivity. Yet, something remarkable happened. Instead of breaking, Zhang Qian observed. He watched the customs, the technologies, and the political structures of the nomadic tribes. He learned of the kingdoms that existed beyond the steppe, lands that were not merely empty wastes, but sophisticated civilizations with their own ambitions and riches. When he finally managed to escape and make his way back to the Han court, he was no longer just a diplomat. He was a walking encyclopedia of a new world. He spoke of the Yuezhi people, of the fertile valleys of Central Asia, and most importantly, he spoke of the potential for connection. He brought word of civilizations that were hungry for Chinese silk, and in return, possessed the very horses the Han desperately required. Zhang Qian's return changed the trajectory of human history. He had inadvertently provided the map for an empire's expansion. The emperor realized that the middle ground between China and the West was not a barrier, but a bridge. The mission had failed its original military objective. The Xiongnu were not immediately defeated, but it had succeeded in a much more profound way. It had transformed the Han dynasty's worldview. The West was no longer a mystery, it was a destination. The strategic necessity of the heavenly horses became the catalyst for state-sponsored exploration. Zhang Qian had opened the gates, turning a desperate search for military allies into the birth of the greatest commercial network the world had ever seen. The Silk Road was no longer just a dream of wandering nomads. It was now an imperial mandate. 130 BCE. The imperial courts of Chang'an, where the air is thick with the scent of incense and the rustle of something far more precious than gold. As Zhang Qian's reports reached the ears of the Han elite, a new reality began to settle over the empire. The gates were open, and the world was looking back at China with an insatiable hunger. But that hunger was not for jade, nor for iron, nor even for the legendary horses of the West. It was for a substance so ethereal, so impossibly soft, that it seemed to have been spun from the moonlight itself. Silk. To the Romans, to the Persians, and to the nomads of the steppes, silk was a miracle. It was a fabric that flowed like water, caught the light like a gemstone, and possessed a luster that no other textile on earth could replicate. It became the ultimate status symbol, a currency of prestige that could buy peace, command armies, and decorate the bodies of emperors. But there was a problem. While the world was dying to possess silk, no one, absolutely no one, knew how it was made. In the eyes of the West, silk was a gift from the gods, a mysterious substance that appeared in shimmering bolts from the East. There were wild myths that it was harvested from the leaves of sacred trees, or perhaps gathered from the clouds themselves. This mystery was not merely a curiosity, it was the foundation of China's economic hegemony. The truth, however, was far more delicate and far more guarded. It was a secret kept under the threat of death. The secret lay in the life cycle of a tiny, unassuming creature, the Bombyx mari, the silkworm. The process, known as sericulture, was a masterpiece of biological manipulation and human patience. It began with the careful cultivation of mulberry trees, the only food these creatures would consume. Then the silkworms were tended to with almost religious devotion, kept in controlled environments, shielded from the wind, the dust, and the prying eyes of foreigners. As the worms grew, they began to spin. They would secrete a liquid protein from their salivary glands, which, upon contact with the air, hardened into a continuous shimmering thread. A single cocoon could contain a strand of silk over a kilometer long. To harvest this, the cocoons had to be carefully heated to kill the pupae inside before they could break the thread, allowing the long, unbroken filaments to be unwound. This process was the most closely guarded state secret in human history. For centuries, the Han dynasty enforced a draconian law. The knowledge of how to produce silk and the eggs of the silkworm itself could never leave the borders of China. To attempt to smuggle a cocoon out of the empire was a crime punishable by death. The Chinese government understood that their monopoly was not just a source of wealth, it was their greatest geopolitical lever. As the Silk Road began to pulse with the movement of caravans, silk became the engine of the entire network. It was the standard of value, the medium of exchange, and the ultimate prize. The secret of sericulture had turned a biological curiosity into a global obsession, creating a demand so powerful that it would eventually reshape the borders of empires and drive men to cross the most treacherous deserts on Earth, all for a single, shimmering thread. 100 BCE. The borders of the Hellenistic world and the edges of the Han Empire. While the secret of silk was being guarded with iron fists in the East, a different kind of collision was occurring in the West. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been the center of a world defined by Greek philosophy, Roman law, and the heavy, structured aesthetics of the West. But as the Silk Road began to breathe, these established cultures were about to experience a shock to their very identity. This was not a conquest of swords, but a conquest of the senses. Imagine a Roman senator, accustomed to the heavy, coarse wools of Italy or the crisp, bleached linens of Egypt. Suddenly, he is presented with a garment that defies the physics he understands. It is light, it is translucent, and it clings to the body with a grace that seems almost scandalous. To the Roman elite, silk was more than a fabric. It was a provocation. It was a sensory revolution that challenged their notions of modesty, wealth, and even morality. The arrival of these Eastern luxuries triggered a cultural fever dream. In the bustling forums of Rome and the sun-drenched markets of Alexandria, the Eastern style began to seep into the fabric of daily life. It wasn't just silk. It was the introduction of exotic spices that turned bland Mediterranean diets into aromatic feasts. It was the arrival of new pigments that changed the colors of art. It was the subtle influence of Eastern mathematics and astronomical concepts filtering through the hands of middlemen. This was the moment of first contact, not a single battle, but a slow-motion collision of two distinct worlds that had previously existed in total isolation. The Hellenistic influence, the legacy of Alexander the Great, had left behind a trail of Greek-style cities and art from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. As these Greek-influenced cultures met the expanding reach of the Han dynasty through the conduits of Central Asia, something miraculous happened. A hybridity was born. In the oasis cities of the Fergana Valley and the Kushan Empire, we begin to see the first archaeological evidence of this fusion. We see statues of the Buddha, carved with the flowing drapery of a Greek Apollo. We see Greco-Roman motifs etched into pottery that was destined for Chinese tables. This contact was a chaotic, beautiful, and often volatile exchange. It was a period of profound misunderstanding and intense fascination. The West viewed the East as a land of myth and infinite mystery, while the East viewed the West as a collection of strange, distant kingdoms of unparalleled appetite. But beneath the beauty of the silk and the aroma of the spices, this contact laid the groundwork for a new global reality. The barriers of geography were being eroded by the sheer force of human desire. The world was shrinking. The isolation that had protected civilizations for millennia was crumbling, replaced by a web of interdependence. For the first time in human history, A decision made in a court in Chang'an could ripple through the markets of Persia and ultimately change the fashion of a woman walking the streets of Rome. The two halves of the world had finally looked into each other's eyes, and there was no turning back. 100 BCE. The shifting sands of the Taklamakan Desert and the high, wind-swept passes of the Pamir Mountains. If the previous era was defined by the shock of first contact, this new era was defined by the rhythm of the journey itself. To understand the Silk Road, one must look past the shimmering silks and the glittering gold, and look instead at the dust, the sweat, and the relentless, beating heart of the caravan. The Silk Road was never a single highway. It was a pulsing, organic network of trails, and at the center of this network was the caravan. To travel these routes was to commit to a life of extreme discipline and calculated risk. This was not a journey for the faint of heart, nor for the solitary wanderer. To survive the vast emptiness between the great empires, one had to move in numbers. The logistics of the caravan were a marvel of ancient engineering. The undisputed king of this movement was the Bactrian camel, the two-humped beast of burden, evolved perfectly for the brutal temperature swings of Central Asia. Capable of carrying hundreds of pounds of cargo while enduring weeks without water, these animals were the heavy-duty engines of the ancient world. Alongside them walked horses, donkeys, and mules, each playing a specific role in the massive, moving cities that these groups formed. A caravan was more than just a group of animals. It was a microcosm of society. Within a single traveling party, you would find a rigid hierarchy. There were the caravan leaders, the seasoned navigators who could read the stars and the subtle shifts in sand dunes to find a hidden well. There were the guards, armed and vigilant, tasked with defending the precious cargo from the bandits who haunted the mountain passes. There were the translators, the linguists who bridged the gap between Sogdian, Chinese, Persian, and Greek. And then, there were the merchants themselves, the dreamers and the pragmatists who staked their entire fortunes on a single successful crossing. The rhythm of life was dictated by the sun and the season. Days were spent in a grueling, slow-motion march, the air thick with the scent of animal musk and the rhythmic jingle of bells used to keep the line together. The heat of the midday sun was an enemy to be endured, and the vastness of the landscape was designed to make a human feel infinitesimally small. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the caravan would transform. The setting of the sun signaled the time for the camp. Fires would be lit, and for a few precious hours the isolation of the desert would be broken. In these nightly gatherings, the true purpose of the Silk Road was revealed. Over shared meals of dried fruit, hard bread, and tea, stories were traded as frequently as goods. A merchant from the Han borders might share news of a new emperor, while a traveler from the West might speak of the strange, massive stone amphitheaters of Rome. This was the caravan's greatest, unwritten commodity: information. In an age before the telegraph or the printing press, the caravan was the world's nervous system. Every step taken by a camel was a pulse of data, carrying news, religion, technology, and myth across the spine of Asia. The caravan life was a grueling, dangerous, and repetitive existence, but it was the only thread capable of stitching the fractured pieces of the human experience into a single, interconnected tapestry. 200 CE. The edge of the Taklamakan Desert, where the relentless winds of the dunes meet the life-giving veins of mountain runoff. If the caravan was the pulsing nervous system of the Silk Road, then the oasis cities were its vital organs. To the uninitiated traveler, the Silk Road might have seemed like a journey through an endless, hostile void. But for those who knew the geography of survival, the desert was not a wasteland. It was a string of pearls. These were the oasis cities, miraculous pockets of green and stone carved out of the arid dust, where the water from the snowmelt of the Kunlun and Tian Shan mountains met the parched earth. Places like Kashgar, Dunhuang, and Samarkand were more than mere rest stops. They were the great urban lungs of the world. As a caravan approached these settlements, the transition was visceral. After weeks of the monotonous, rhythmic march through the dunes, the sight of a walled city and a shimmering pool of water felt less like a destination and more like a resurrection. These cities were born of necessity, but they grew through prosperity. Because every traveler, every merchant, and every diplomat was forced to pause here to rest their animals and replenish their supplies, these cities became the ultimate melting pots. They were the world's first truly cosmopolitan hubs. In the markets of Kashgar, you wouldn't just hear the haggling of traders. You would hear a symphony of human existence. Within a single afternoon, a merchant might navigate a conversation through a dozen different tongues: Sogdian, Tocharian, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Persian. The architecture of these cities reflected this collision of worlds. You might see a Buddhist stupa rising toward the sky, its intricate carvings telling stories of enlightenment, standing just a short walk from a Zoroastrian fire temple, or a bustling marketplace filled with the scents of West Asian spices and Eastern tea. The wealth flowing through these gates was staggering. It was here that the raw materials of the world were refined and exchanged. A merchant arriving from the east would unload heavy bolts of silk, only to trade them for the translucent glassware of the Roman West, the cobalt pigments of Persia, or the fragrant frankincense of the Arabian Peninsula. But the importance of the oasis cities went far beyond the exchange of physical goods. They were the great intellectual clearinghouses of antiquity. In the quiet courtyards of Dunhuang, monks sat in meditation, translating sacred texts from Sanskrit into Chinese, preserving the wisdom of the ages in the process. In the libraries and academies of Samarkand, scholars debated mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, blending the scientific traditions of Greece, India, and China. These cities were the anchors of civilization in a sea of sand. They provided the infrastructure of trade, the caravanserais, those fortified inns that offered safety from bandits and a place to exchange the most valuable commodity of all, news. To sit in a courtyard in a Silk Road oasis was to be at the center of the known world. You were not just a traveler in a desert. You were a witness to the unfolding of human history. As the empires of the East and West ebbed and flowed, these oasis cities remained constant, the indispensable gateways through which the spirit of humanity passed, transforming the isolation of the desert into a bridge of connection. 300 CE. The shadow of the Magao Caves, where the cliffs of Dunhuang rise like silent sentinels against the shifting sands of the Gobi. If the oasis cities provided the physical sanctuary for the Silk Road, it was the ideas carried within them that provided its soul. For centuries, the routes had moved silk, spices, and gold, tangible goods with a clear price. But as the caravans moved, they carried something far more volatile and transformative: faith. This was not merely the movement of people, but the migration of the human spirit, a process of spiritual contagion that would rewrite the cultural DNA of entire continents. The most profound of these movements was the westward and eastward expansion of Buddhism. Originating in the fertile plains of northern India, Buddhism began its long, arduous journey across the Hindu Kush mountains. It did not travel through conquest or the edge of a sword, but through the quiet persistence of the pilgrim and the merchant. To the traveler, religion was a compass. In the terrifying vastness of the Taklamakan, where a wrong turn meant certain death, the rituals and prayers of a shared faith provided a psychological lifeline. As Buddhist monks traveled alongside merchant caravans, they brought more than just sutras. They brought a new way of seeing the world. In the bustling markets of the oasis cities, the philosophy of detachment and the pursuit of enlightenment began to mingle with the pragmatic concerns of trade. The wealth generated by the Silk Road became the fuel for this religious expansion. Great monasteries were carved directly into the living rock of cliffs, funded by the very merchants who sought divine protection for their perilous journeys. These cave temples, like those at Dunhuang, became the great repositories of this wandering faith. Inside their dim, incense-filled chambers, one could witness a breathtaking visual synthesis. You would see the serene, meditative faces of Buddha, yet the artistic styles were a dizzying mosaic. The flowing drapery of Hellenistic Greek sculpture, the delicate linework of Indian aesthetics, and the rhythmic compositions of Chinese artistry. It was a visual language of globalization, proving that while gods may belong to specific lands, their stories were universal. But Buddhism was not the only traveler. The Silk Road was a spiritual highway with many lanes. From the west, the fires of Zoroastrianism flickered through the Central Asian steppes, carried by Persian merchants who maintained their sacred hearths even thousands of miles from their homeland. From the Levant, the early whispers of Christianity began to creep eastward, following the established trade arteries toward the heart of the Han and Tang empires. And as the centuries progressed, the arrival of Islam would bring a new, powerful wave of monotheism, reshaping the political and social landscapes of the oasis cities forever. This was the true, invisible cargo of the Silk Road. A merchant might arrive in a city carrying nothing but a handful of peppercorns, but he might leave having encountered a new concept of the afterlife, a different way of understanding time, or a new method of prayer. The Silk Road did not just connect markets, it connected minds. It ensured that no culture remained an island, and that the heavens themselves were part of the great, unending exchange. 750 CE. The bustling markets of Chang'an, where the air is thick with the scent of sandalwood and the frantic energy of a world in motion. If the movement of faith had provided the Silk Road with its soul, then the movement of technology would provide its skeleton. For centuries, the knowledge of the East had been whispered in the shadows of monasteries and the privacy of imperial courts. But as the Tang dynasty reached its zenith, two silent revolutions began to leak out from the borders of China, traveling along the same dusty arteries that once carried silk and sutras. These were not goods to be tasted or worn, but inventions that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human civilization: paper and gunpowder. Before the widespread arrival of paper, the written word was a heavy, cumbersome thing. In the West, scholars labored over expensive parchment made from animal skins, or heavy clay tablets that were difficult to transport. But in the East, a lighter, more efficient medium had been perfected. By blending macerated plant fibers, mulberry bark, hemp, and even old rags, with water and a fine mesh screen, Chinese artisans had created a miracle of economy. Paper was cheap, it was light, and most importantly, it was portable. As paper began its westward trek, it did more than just facilitate trade ledgers. It became the vessel for the world's intellect. It allowed for the mass replication of religious texts, the preservation of scientific observations, and the administrative cohesion of sprawling empires. When the secret of papermaking finally breached the borders of the Islamic world, legendarily following the Battle of Talas, it ignited an intellectual explosion. From Samarkand to Baghdad, the availability of paper fueled the Islamic Golden Age, turning libraries into the beating hearts of new urban centers and creating a bridge of shared knowledge that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. Yet if paper was the medium of the mind, then gunpowder was the force of the hand. Its origins were far less intentional, born of a quest for immortality. Alchemists in the Tang dynasty, searching for an elixir of eternal life, stumbled upon a volatile mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. They had inadvertently discovered a way to harness the sudden, violent expansion of gases, a discovery that would eventually shatter the medieval world. Initially, gunpowder was a tool of spectacle and defense, used for ceremonial fireworks or simple incendiary arrows. But as the formula traveled along the Silk Road, carried by soldiers, merchants, and nomadic conquerors, its application grew increasingly lethal. The chemistry of destruction moved with the speed of a galloping horse. It transformed the nature of warfare, turning the impenetrable stone walls of ancient fortresses into vulnerabilities and rendering the armored knight obsolete. These two technologies, paper and gunpowder, represent the dual nature of the Silk Road's legacy. One allowed humanity to record its history, to share its dreams, and to build a collective memory. The other gave humanity the power to reshape the physical world through force. Together, they were the ultimate travelers, invisible and unstoppable, ensuring that once the spark of innovation was lit in the East, it could never be extinguished by the vast distances of the West. 600 CE. The sun-drenched valleys of Sogdiana, nestled in the heart of modern-day Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. If paper was the medium of the mind and gunpowder the force of the hand, then there was a third, even more vital element required to keep this vast machine of exchange turning: the human engine. For the Silk Road to function, it needed more than just technology and faith. It needed a class of people who were equally comfortable in a Buddhist monastery, a Persian court, or a Chinese marketplace. It needed the ultimate middlemen. It needed the Sogdians. While the great empires of the Tang, the Persians, and the Byzantines fought for territorial dominance, the Sogdians, a group of Eastern Iranian people centered around the legendary oasis cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, focused on a different kind of conquest, the conquest of commerce. They did not seek to rule lands but to link them. The Sogdians were the undisputed masters of the caravan. They were not merely traders, they were the logistical architects of the ancient world. To understand their impact, one must look at the sheer scale of their operation. A Sogdian merchant did not simply travel from point A to point B. They managed complex networks of credit, established diplomatic outposts in foreign capitals, and mastered a dozen different languages to ensure that a contract signed in the mountains of the Pamirs would be honored in the markets of Chang'an. They were the connective tissue of Eurasia. Because they lived in the central hubs of the Silk Road, they possessed a unique cosmopolitan perspective. They were polyglots and cultural chameleons. In the bustling streets of the Tang dynasty, Sogdian merchants were a common sight, bringing with them not just exotic goods like silver, musk, and precious stones, but also new fashions, music, and even new gods. They were the ones who facilitated the flow of luxury, turning the Silk Road from a series of disconnected paths into a synchronized global economy. Their influence was so profound that the Sogdian language became the lingua franca of Central Asian trade, the common tongue that allowed a merchant from the Mediterranean to negotiate with a traveler from the Yellow River. Their letters, discovered in the ruins of desert outposts, reveal a sophisticated world of family businesses, complex legal disputes, and a constant, pulsing awareness of distant markets. They operated through a system of diaspora communities. Wherever a Sogdian went, a small network of kin followed, creating a safety net of trust and intelligence that spanned thousands of miles. But the Sogdians were more than just accountants of the desert. They were the primary conduits of culture. When a new religious idea, be it Manichaeism, Nestorian Christianity, or Buddhism, moved along the routes, it was often a Sogdian merchant who carried the scripture in his pack and the faith in his heart. They were the translators of the world, turning the abstract ideas of one civilization into the understandable terms of another. As we look back at the peak of the Silk Road, we see that the era was not defined solely by the empires that sat upon the land, but by the people who moved across it. The Sogdians proved that in a world of borders and walls, the greatest power belonged to those who could bridge the gaps. They were the heartbeat of the Silk Road, the invisible thread that wove the disparate fragments of the ancient world into a single, shimmering tapestry of human connection. 750 CE. The gates of Chang'an, the eastern terminus of the Silk Road and the beating heart of the Tang dynasty. If the Sogdians were the engine of the Silk Road, then the Tang dynasty was its grand, shimmering stage. As the Sogdian caravans poured through the Hexi corridor, they were not merely entering a city. They were entering the most sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and populous metropolis the world had ever seen. Chang'an was a city of over 1 million souls, a planned masterpiece of grid-like precision that functioned as the gravitational center of the known world. During this peak, the Tang Empire did not just tolerate foreign influence, it inhaled it. The dynasty's philosophy was one of unprecedented openness. To walk the streets of the Chang'an markets was to witness a kaleidoscope of humanity. Here, the air was thick with the scent of Central Asian spices and the sounds of foreign melodies. You would see Persian musicians playing the lute, Turkic cavalrymen patrolling the outskirts, and Indian monks debating philosophy in the shadow of gilded pagodas. This was the era of Western fever. The Tang aristocracy became obsessed with the exotic. The traditional, understated elegance of early Chinese aesthetics was swept away by a tidal wave of Central Asian fashion. High-ranking officials abandoned heavy traditional robes for the tight-sleeved tunics of the steppe. Ladies of the court adopted the Hu style, wearing foreign makeup, and even riding horses through the city streets, a radical departure from the seclusion of previous eras. Exotic luxuries were no longer just for the ultra-wealthy. They were the symbols of a sophisticated, globalized identity. Silverware from Sasanian Persia, cobalt from the west, and fragrant woods from the south flowed into the Tang capital, fueling an economic explosion that turned China into the world's manufacturing powerhouse. But the Tang peak was more than a celebration of consumerism. It was a golden age of intellectual synthesis. The stability provided by the Tang military and the efficiency of their administrative systems created a sanctuary for ideas. Because the Silk Road was at its most secure, the exchange was not limited to silk and silver. It was an exchange of the soul. Under the protection of the Tang, Buddhism reached its zenith in China, evolving from a foreign import into a deeply integrated pillar of Chinese life. The massive cave complexes of Dunhuang, acting as the gateway to the capital, became repositories of this fusion, where Indian iconography met Chinese brushwork, creating an artistic language that was entirely new. This was a period where the Great Tang defined what it meant to be a superpower. It was a superpower not just through the strength of its armies, but through the strength of its magnetism. The Tang dynasty created an ecosystem where a merchant from the Mediterranean could find a familiar rhythm in a Chinese market, and a scholar from the Yellow River could find profound truths in a Sanskrit text. Yet this splendor was as fragile as it was magnificent. The very connectivity that made the Tang era so glorious also made it vulnerable. The wealth, the people, and the ideas moving along these routes were part of a single, interconnected organism. As we will see, the same currents that brought the world to Chang'an would eventually bring the winds of change that would reshape the empire forever. 750 CE. Baghdad, the burgeoning capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a city rising from the dust of Mesopotamia to become the intellectual pulse of the planet. While the Tang dynasty was perfecting the art of cosmopolitan splendor in the East, a new, seismic force was shifting the center of gravity in the West. The rapid expansion of the Islamic caliphates had done more than redraw the maps of the Middle East. It had unified a vast, fractured territory under a single language, a single legal system, and a single faith. For the first time in history, a merchant could travel from the edges of North Africa to the borders of Central Asia under the protection of a singular administrative umbrella. This was the dawn of the Islamic Golden Age, an era where the Silk Road was no longer just a series of disconnected paths, but a cohesive artery pumping the lifeblood of knowledge, faith, and commerce across the Afro-Eurasian landmass. At the heart of this explosion was Baghdad. Designed as a round city, it was a geometric marvel that functioned as a massive vacuum, pulling in the finest minds, the rarest goods, and the most profound ideas from every corner of the known world. If Chang'an was the stage, Baghdad was the laboratory. Here, the Silk Road's true cargo, intellectual capital, was being processed and refined. Under the patronage of caliphs like Harun al-Rashid, the legendary House of Wisdom was established. This was not merely a library, but a grand engine of synthesis. Scholars, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Persian, gathered here to translate the lost wisdom of the Greeks, the mathematical breakthroughs of the Indians, and the astronomical observations of the Persians into Arabic. This linguistic unification acted as a bridge. Arabic became the lingua franca of science, much as English is today, allowing a scholar in Samarkand to read the works of a philosopher in Cordoba. But this intellectual fever had a physical counterpart, the movement of goods. The Islamic Caliphate sat at the ultimate crossroads. To the east lay the riches of China and the sophisticated markets of the Tang. To the west, the Mediterranean and the burgeoning trade of Europe. To the south, the spice-laden maritime routes of the Indian Ocean. The Islamic world did not just facilitate trade, it revolutionized it. The introduction of advanced banking techniques, such as the suftaja, an early form of the check, allowed merchants to deposit funds in one city and withdraw them in another, thousands of miles away. This reduced the risk of highway robbery and allowed capital to flow with unprecedented velocity. The caravans were no longer just carrying silk and spices. They were carrying the tools of a modern economy. As Islamic influence pushed eastward, it met the Silk Road's existing currents, creating a magnificent cultural friction. In the bustling markets of Baghdad and the oasis cities of Persia, One could find Chinese porcelain being traded for Islamic glassware, or Indian mathematics being applied to Persian astronomy. This was a period of profound synthesis, where the scientific rigor of the West met the technological ingenuity of the East. Yet this era of unprecedented connectivity was not without its shadows. The same routes that facilitated the flow of gold and wisdom also served as conduits for conflict. The massive expansion of the caliphate brought it into direct, often violent contact with the existing powers of the East. The world was becoming more integrated, yes, but it was also becoming more volatile, as the empires of the Silk Road began to collide in a struggle for the soul of the world's trade. 751 CE. The Talas River in the fertile valleys of modern-day Kyrgyzstan. For decades, the expansion of the Abbasid Caliphate and the westward push of the Tang dynasty had been like two great tectonic plates, moving slowly toward an inevitable collision. To the west, the Islamic world was a rising tide of faith and commerce. To the east, the Tang dynasty represented the pinnacle of organized, imperial power. The buffer between them was the fractured landscape of Central Asia, a mosaic of Turkic tribes and oasis kingdoms that were increasingly being forced to choose a side. The tension finally snapped when the Tang emperor, seeking to assert control over the vital Silk Road corridors, moved to secure the Fergana Valley. This maneuver directly threatened the interests of the Abbasid Caliphate, which viewed the expansion of Chinese influence as a barrier to their own eastward momentum. When the two armies finally met on the banks of the Talas River, it was not merely a border skirmish. It was a clash of civilizations. On one side stood the disciplined, heavy infantry and crossbowmen of the Tang, a military machine that had dominated East Asia for centuries. On the other stood the highly mobile, motivated cavalry of the Abbasid forces, bolstered by local Turkic allies who saw the caliphate as a more sympathetic patron than the distant Chinese emperor. The battle was fierce and indecisive in its initial stages, a chaotic swirl of dust, steel, and blood under the Central Asian sun. But the turning point came not from a grand tactical maneuver, but from a sudden, devastating shift in allegiance. The Karluk Turks, who had been fighting alongside the Tang, suddenly turned on their Chinese allies. This betrayal shattered the Tang lines, turning a controlled engagement into a catastrophic rout. The once mighty Chinese army was broken, forced into a desperate retreat that would eventually see them driven far from the heart of the Silk Road. History often measures the importance of a battle by the territory gained or lost. By that metric, the Battle of Talas was a localized victory for the Caliphate, marking the end of Chinese political dominance in Central Asia and paving the way for the permanent Islamization of the region. But the true significance of Talas lies in a much more subtle, much more profound consequence: the capture of technology. Among the prisoners taken by the victorious Abbasid forces were skilled craftsmen from the Tang Empire. These were not just soldiers, but artisans, men who held the secrets of the East in their hands. Chief among them were papermakers. Before this moment, the West had relied on expensive parchment made from animal skins or the cumbersome papyrus of Egypt. The secret of paper, a lightweight, durable, and inexpensive medium, had been a closely guarded Chinese monopoly. But as these prisoners were marched back toward the heart of the Islamic world, they carried something far more valuable than gold: the recipe for paper. From the workshops of Samarkand, the technology began to spread with lightning speed. It reached Baghdad, fueling the very intellectual explosion we have just witnessed. It enabled the mass production of books, the rapid dissemination of scientific texts, and the birth of the great libraries of the Golden Age. The Battle of Talas, fought with swords and spears, ended up being the catalyst for a revolution of the mind. Through the medium of paper, the knowledge of the Silk Road would no longer be confined to a few elite scrolls, but would become the shared heritage of a changing world. 800 CE, Baghdad, the circular jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate. If the Battle of Talas provided the medium for a revolution, the paper upon which ideas could be written, then it was the Persian spirit that provided the soul of that revolution. To understand the Silk Road during this era, one must look past the borders of empires and into the profound, invisible influence of the Persian people. Though the political map was increasingly colored by Islamic expansion, the cultural DNA of the Silk Road remained deeply, unshakably Persian. As the Abbasid caliphs consolidated their power, they did not merely rule over a collection of conquered territories. They presided over a sophisticated synthesis of traditions. And at the heart of this synthesis sat the Persian bureaucracy, the Persian poets, and the Persian scientists. For centuries, the Persian Empire had been the bridge between the Mediterranean and the Indus. They were the masters of the middle ground. Even as new religious identities took hold, the administrative genius of the Sasanian past survived. The Persian model of governance, with its intricate tax systems, its organized postal networks, and its highly educated class of scribes, became the blueprint for the caliphate. This wasn't just about politics. It was about the infrastructure of trade. The Silk Road required more than just courage. It required the ability to manage vast distances, to calculate complex exchange rates, and to maintain the stability of oasis cities. This was a Persian specialty. But the influence went far deeper than the halls of government. It flowed into the very way the world thought. As the paper mills of Samarkand began to churn out sheets of knowledge, it was Persian intellectuals who stepped forward to fill them. In the great houses of wisdom, the scholars were often Persians or those trained in the Persian tradition. They were the ones who took the ancient, fragmented wisdom of Greece, India, and China, and wove it into a single, coherent tapestry of human understanding. Consider mathematics. The decimal system and the concept of zero traveling from India were refined and systematized by Persian minds like Al-Khwarizmi. His work didn't just advance arithmetic. It gave the merchants of the Silk Road the tools to calculate profits, risks, and long-distance credit with unprecedented precision. Consider astronomy. The sophisticated instruments used to navigate the trackless deserts and the vast Indian Ocean were perfected by Persian astronomers, whose star charts allowed caravans to move through the night with confidence. Even the aesthetic of the Silk Road was painted in Persian hues. The intricate patterns of silk, the geometry of glazed ceramics, and the lyrical beauty of the poetry exchanged in the caravanserais all bore the unmistakable mark of Persian artistry. It was a culture of refinement, a high culture that was as much a commodity as spice or jade. As the Silk Road expanded, it became a conveyor belt for a Persianized worldview. A merchant in Chang'an might wear a robe inspired by Persian motifs. A scholar in Cordoba might study a text written on paper, using math developed by a Persian mind, to explain a cosmos mapped by Persian eyes. The Persian influence was the silent, golden thread that stitched the disparate pieces of the Silk Road into a unified, intellectual and commercial whole. They were the architects of the Golden Age, turning a network of trade routes into a global highway of human progress. 750 CE. The Arabian Sea, where the horizon dissolves into a shimmering, endless blue. If the Persian influence provided the intellectual soul of this era, it was the rhythmic, seasonal heartbeat of the planet itself that provided the engine for its expansion. While the great land caravans labored across the grueling, sun-scorched stretches of the Central Asian steppes, a different kind of revolution was unfolding on the water. A revolution dictated not by the whims of kings or the strength of camels, but by the very air itself. To understand the rise of the maritime Silk Road, one must understand the monsoons. For the sailors of the Indian Ocean, the wind was not a mere weather pattern. It was a celestial clock. For centuries, the seasonal reversal of these winds had remained a terrifying mystery to the West, but to the mariners of the East and the Arab traders of the South, it was the ultimate navigator. In the summer months, the southwest monsoon blows with relentless fury, pushing vessels from the coast of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula toward the shores of India and Southeast Asia. It is a heavy, moisture-laden wind that acts as a massive, invisible hand, propelling dhows and junks across vast distances that would be impossible through rowing or sail alone. But the ocean is a fickle master. To sail against these winds was to invite disaster. Instead, the merchants of the Golden Age learned the art of patience. They learned to wait. As the summer winds drove them toward the east, the traders would settle in the great coastal hubs, Malacca, Calicut, and Guangzhou. They did not merely pass through, they stayed. They built communities, married into local families, and exchanged more than just spices and ceramics. They exchanged languages, faiths, and technologies. These port cities became the maritime equivalent of the oasis towns like Samarkand, acting as melting pots where the world's cultures collided and fused. Then, as the seasons turned, the great reversal would occur. The northeast monsoon would arrive, sweeping from the Asian continent back toward the west. This was the signal. The warehouses were filled. The hulls were weighted with heavy cargoes of cloves, nutmeg, and fine porcelain, and the sails were unfurled. The winds that had brought them to the east would now carry them home, sweeping them back across the Indian Ocean toward the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. This seasonal cycle created a predictable, reliable rhythm for global commerce. It allowed for a scale of trade that the land routes could never match. A single merchant vessel, riding the monsoon, could carry a cargo weight equivalent to 1,000 camels, moving goods that were once considered impossibly rare into the hands of the masses. As the Abbasid Caliphate grew in power, its reach extended far beyond the deserts of Iraq. Through the mastery of these winds, the Islamic world became a maritime superpower, linking the Mediterranean economy to the riches of the South China Sea. The maritime route was no longer a secondary path. It was becoming the primary artery of the world. The Silk Road was no longer just a line drawn across the dust of Eurasia. It had become a loop, a grand, oceanic circuit that connected the heart of the Caliphate to the furthest reaches of the East, all choreographed by the breathing of the earth itself. The winds had arrived, and the world was about to get much, much smaller. 1035 CE. The vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, where the horizon is a jagged line of grass and sky. While the monsoon winds were weaving a maritime web across the Indian Ocean, a different kind of storm was gathering on the land. For centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate had acted as the great stabilizer of the Silk Road, providing a centralized authority that protected the caravans and the cities. But by the 11th century, that stability was fracturing. The central authority in Baghdad was waning, leaving a power vacuum that stretched from the mountains of Iran to the gates of Byzantium. Into this void stepped a people who had lived their entire lives in the rhythm of the horse and the bow, the Seljuks. The Seljuks were Oghuz Turks, nomadic warriors from the depths of the Central Asian steppes. For generations, they had lived as pastoralists, their lives dictated by the needs of their herds and the migrations of their tribes. But they were more than just nomads. They were a people possessed of an unparalleled martial discipline and an explosive energy that the settled empires of the Middle East were unprepared to meet. The rise of the Seljuks was not a slow evolution, but a lightning strike. Led by charismatic chieftains like Tranquil Beg, these Turkic warriors began a relentless southward and westward migration. They did not come merely to raid. They came to conquer, to settle, and to rule. They moved like a tide, sweeping through the Khorasan region, absorbing the Persian administrative traditions and the Islamic faith, and fusing them into a new, formidable identity. By 1055, Tranquil Beg entered Baghdad, not as a destroyer but as a savior. The Abbasid Caliph, once the most powerful man in the Islamic world, was now little more than a figurehead. The Seljuks had become the sultans, the holders of power. They were the new guardians of the Islamic heartland, and with their arrival, the geopolitical map of the Silk Road was fundamentally rewritten. This was a turning point of immense complexity. On one hand, the Seljuk Empire brought a new era of Turkic military might that could defend the trade routes from smaller, fractured raiding parties. They revitalized the great Persianate cities, patronizing scholars, architects, and poets, effectively bridging the gap between the nomadic steppe and the sophisticated urbanity of the Silk Road. But on the other hand, their rise signaled the end of the old order. The Seljuk expansion brought the Islamic world into direct, violent confrontation with the Byzantine Empire to the west. The clash of these two titans would eventually lead to the Battle of Manzikert, a seismic event that would forever alter the balance of power in Anatolia and send shockwaves through Europe and Asia alike. As the Seljuk banners unfurled across the plateau of Iran and into the Levant, the Silk Road entered a period of intense transformation. The routes were no longer just paths for merchants. They were the arteries of a massive, military-driven empire. The Silk Road was being reshaped by the hoofbeats of Turkic cavalry, proving that while the winds could move the ships, it was the strength of the sword that would decide who controlled the dust. 1092 CE. The bustling marketplaces of Merv and the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, where the air is thick with the scent of spices and the tension of shifting loyalties. The thunderous arrival of the Seljuk Turks had fundamentally altered the landscape, but the stability they promised was often as fleeting as a desert mirage. As the empire expanded, it did not remain a monolithic block of power. Instead, it began to splinter. What had been a centralized corridor of trade was rapidly becoming a jagged mosaic of competing principalities, local warlords, and restless emirs. This was the era of fragmentation. The great Seljuk hegemony, once a shield for the merchant caravans, was fracturing into smaller, often warring Turkoman states. In the west, the rise of the Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia created a new, fiercely independent frontier. In the east, local dynasties began to assert their own sovereignty, carving out fiefdoms that turned once smooth trade arteries into a labyrinth of checkpoints, tolls, and territorial disputes. For the merchant, this fragmentation was a logistical nightmare. To travel from the markets of Chang'an to the ports of the Levant, A caravan could no longer rely on a single imperial decree for protection. Instead, they had to navigate a geopolitical minefield. A route that was safe 1 month might be closed the next due to a sudden succession crisis in a distant city, or a local governor might decide to impose exorbitant taxes to fund a private militia. The Silk Road was no longer a singular highway. It had become a collection of broken threads. This instability forced a profound evolution in the nature of trade. Merchants were forced to become diplomats and master strategists. They began to favor smaller, more frequent shipments rather than the massive, vulnerable caravans of the past. They sought out middleman cities that could offer neutrality, pockets of relative peace amidst the surrounding chaos. The very geography of trade began to shift. Paths that had been used for centuries were abandoned in favor of more circuitous, albeit longer, routes that skirted the edges of conflict zones. Furthermore, this political fragmentation invited a different kind of movement. As centralized control waned, the borders became porous. This was not just a movement of goods, but a movement of ideas, refugees, and unconventional warriors. The constant friction between these smaller states acted like a bellows, fanning the flames of cultural exchange even as it dampened the ease of commerce. New artistic styles, born from the blending of Turkic, Persian, and Byzantine influences, began to emerge in the borderlands, fueled by the very instability that made travel so perilous. Yet beneath the surface of this chaos, a deeper transformation was taking place. The fragmentation of the land routes was inadvertently pushing the world's eyes toward the horizon of the sea. As the terrestrial paths became more expensive, more dangerous, and more politically volatile, the maritime routes of the Indian Ocean began to whisper a different promise. The promise of a route free from the whims of local sultans and the heavy hand of land-based warfare. The Silk Road was breaking apart, its golden era of unified imperial protection giving way to a fractured reality. But in this fragmentation, the seeds of a new, more complex and more globalized world were being sown. The dust of the breaking empires was settling, and as it did, it revealed a world that was becoming larger, more divided, and more interconnected than ever before. 1206 CE. The windswept steppes of Mongolia, where the horizon is an endless sea of grass and the sky feels heavy with the weight of destiny. For decades, the Silk Road had been a broken thing, a jagged, dangerous collection of splintered routes where the merchant's greatest enemy was not the desert, but the unpredictable whims of local warlords. But as the 13th century dawned, a new sound began to drown out the chaos of the fragmented emirates. It was not the sound of haggling in a marketplace, nor the rhythmic step of a camel caravan. It was the rhythmic, thunderous hoofbeat of a million horses, moving as a single, unstoppable force. Temujin, the man the world would come to fear as Genghis Khan, had achieved the impossible. He had unified the warring steppe tribes, forged them into a machine of unparalleled discipline, and turned their collective fury toward the settled worlds of the East and West. As the Mongol shadow began to stretch across Eurasia, it did not move like a traditional army. It moved like a storm front, where the Seljuks and the various regional dynasties had offered only localized, fragile stability. The Mongol expansion brought a terrifying, absolute transformation. They did not merely conquer cities. They dismantled the old political order entirely. The patchwork of checkpoints, tolls, and warring fiefdoms that had choked the Silk Road for centuries was being swept away under the hooves of the Mongol cavalry. to the sedentary civilizations of the Silk Road, the Persians, the Khwarezmians, the Chinese. The arrival of the Mongols felt like the end of the world. Cities that had stood for a millennium were leveled. Irrigation systems that fed oasis towns were destroyed. The very blood of the merchant class was spilled in the streets of Samarkand and Merv. This was the shadow of Genghis Khan, a darkness of fire and steel that threatened to extinguish the light of civilization itself. But history is rarely a simple tale of destruction. As the smoke cleared from the conquered territories, a strange and paradoxical phenomenon began to emerge from the ruins. The Mongols were brutal, yes, but they were also profoundly pragmatic. They understood that while gold could be looted, trade could be harvested. Once the initial, violent conquest was complete, the Mongols did something no previous empire had achieved. They imposed a singular, ironclad authority over the entire length of the Silk Road. The fractured threads of the previous century were being woven back together into a single, unbreakable cord. For the first time in history, a merchant could, in theory, travel from the shores of the Yellow Sea to the gates of Eastern Europe under the protection of a single legal code. The terror of the conquest gave way to a newfound, disciplined order. The borders that had once been labyrinthine walls were now open gates, governed by the absolute will of the great Khan. The shadow of Genghis Khan was indeed dark, cast by the fires of conquest. But as that shadow fell across the continent, it provided a strange kind of shelter. Under the terrifying umbrella of Mongol hegemony, the Silk Road was about to enter its most unified, most secure, and most transformative era. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the world was being reconnected. 1227 CE. The vast expanse of the Eurasian steppe, where the blood of conquest has finally begun to dry into the soil. The era of total annihilation had passed, and in its wake, a phenomenon emerged that defied the logic of the era. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. It was a peace born not of diplomacy or mutual understanding, but of absolute, terrifying dominance. The Mongols had broken the world so completely that there were no longer any rival powers left to challenge them. The local warlords, the petty kings, and the fractured caliphates had been swept aside, leaving a vacuum that only the great Khan could fill. Imagine, for a moment, the perspective of a merchant in the year 1250. Before the Mongol rise, a journey from Venice to Beijing was a gauntlet of death. You would have to negotiate with dozens of different rulers, pay 100 different tolls, and pray that your caravan didn't stumble into a local skirmish between two warring princes. Every mile was a gamble, every border was a new threat. But under the Pax Mongolica, the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. The Mongol Empire had established a singular, unified legal framework known as the Yasa. This code of law was applied with brutal consistency from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea. To strike a merchant was to strike the Khan himself. To rob a caravan was to invite the swift, lethal retribution of the Mongol Tumans. For the first time in human history, the Silk Road was no longer a series of disconnected paths, but a single, protected highway. This security acted like a massive stimulant for the global economy. Because the risks of travel had plummeted, the volume of trade skyrocketed. Luxury goods, silk, spices, fine ceramics, and precious stones began to flow with a fluidity never seen before. But it wasn't just physical goods moving through the mountain passes and desert basins. The Mongol peace created a corridor for the movement of ideas, technologies, and faiths. A physician from Persia could find work in a Chinese court. A mathematician from Baghdad could share his secrets with scholars in Karakoram. The world was, in a very real sense, shrinking. The Mongols, ever the pragmatists, realized that they did not need to understand the cultures they ruled so long as they could tax them. They became the ultimate facilitators of globalization. They encouraged the movement of skilled artisans, diplomats, and merchants, viewing them as the lifeblood of their imperial treasury. They were the architects of a new, interconnected world order, where the distant reaches of humanity were suddenly, violently, and irrevocably brought into contact. Yet this peace was a double-edged sword. The very connectivity that allowed for the flourishing of trade and the exchange of wisdom also created a terrifying new vulnerability. The same roads that carried silk and spices, and the same postal networks that carried the Khan's decrees, were now perfect conduits for something far more insidious. The paths were open, the guards were vigilant, and the caravans were moving faster than ever before. But beneath the surface of this golden age, a silent, microscopic passenger was hitching a ride, waiting for the moment when the very connectivity of the Mongol peace would turn into a global catastrophe. 1271 CE. The bustling canals and salt-scented air of Venice, Italy. While the Mongol Empire was carving out a new world order in the east, a young man named Marco Polo was preparing to step into its orbit. He was not a soldier, nor a conqueror, but a merchant, a product of a maritime republic that lived and breathed trade. Alongside his father, Niccolo, and his uncle, Maffei, the 20-year-old Marco set out on a journey that would transform the Silk Road from a series of rumors into a vivid, lived reality for the Western world. As the Polos moved eastward, they were not merely traveling. They were utilizing the very infrastructure we have just discussed. They moved through the veins of the Pax Mongolica. They relied on the safety of the Mongol law, the efficiency of the mountain passes, and the sheer logistical stability that the Great Khan had imposed upon the chaos of Central Asia. For the Polos, the Silk Road was no longer a terrifying gauntlet of warring princes. It was a corridor of opportunity. Their journey was a grueling odyssey of endurance. They traversed the blistering heat of the Middle East, the jagged, oxygen-thin peaks of the Pamir Mountains, and the unforgiving, shifting sands of the Gobi Desert. But as they pushed deeper into the heart of Asia, the landscape began to change from one of survival to one of wonder. The Polos eventually reached the court of Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, the most powerful man on earth. Here, in the sprawling, sophisticated cities of the Yuan dynasty, Marco Polo witnessed things that his fellow Europeans would have dismissed as pure fantasy. He saw a civilization that was, in many ways, centuries ahead of his own. He observed the use of paper money, a concept as alien to a Venetian as magic, and the burning of black stones that provided heat and light, what we now know as coal. He marveled at the intricate postal systems and the sheer scale of cities like Hangzhou, which dwarfed any metropolis in Europe. Marco Polo did not merely visit the East, he became a part of it. He served the Khan, acting as an emissary and an official, traveling to the far reaches of the empire, perhaps even touching the edges of Southeast Asia and the fringes of the Himalayas. He lived in the splendor of the Mongol court, absorbing the customs, the languages, and the immense wealth of a world that felt, to him, like a dream made manifest. When the Polos finally returned to Venice decades later, they were changed men, carrying with them tales of unimaginable riches and strange wonders. But it was the book that followed, the travels of Marco Polo, that would leave the most permanent mark on history. Written while he was in a Genoese prison, His memoirs provided the first detailed eyewitness account of the Silk Road's true potential. To his contemporaries, his stories were the million lies, filled with creatures and customs that seemed impossible. But to the explorers, cartographers, and ambitious merchants of the coming centuries, his words were a siren song. He had mapped the unknown with his descriptions. He had turned the Silk Road from a myth into a destination. And in doing so, he unwittingly planted the seeds of a new age of discovery, an age that would eventually seek to bypass the very land routes he had so famously chronicled. 1275 CE, the sprawling, sun-drenched plains of the Eurasian steppe. While Marco Polo was marveling at the splendor of the Khan's court, the true heartbeat of the Mongol Empire was not found in its palaces, but in its movement. If the Silk Road was the body of the empire, then the Yam system was its nervous system, a lightning-fast network of communication that allowed a single command from the capital to reach the furthest edges of the known world with unprecedented speed. To the modern eye, we might call it the world's first high-speed postal service, but to the Mongols, the Yam, or Erderer, was a tool of absolute control and divine efficiency. It was a logistical marvel that turned the vast, terrifying distances of Central Asia into a manageable, interconnected grid. Imagine, if you will, a messenger on horseback. He is not merely a rider, he is a vital link in a chain that stretches thousands of miles. He carries a pesa, a heavy metal tablet, often gold, silver, or iron, acting as a high-level imperial passport. This tablet is his authority. It tells every official, every village elder, and every station master that this man carries the voice of the great Khan himself. To obstruct him is to defy the heavens. The system was built upon a series of relay stations, spaced roughly 25 to 30 miles apart. The distance, a horse could gallop at full tilt before needing rest. These stations were more than mere stops. They were highly organized hubs of resources. Each station maintained a constant supply of fresh, rested horses, food, and lodging for the messengers. As the messenger approaches a station, he does not slow down. He rides at a breakneck pace, pushing his mount to the absolute limit. Just as the horse begins to falter, he reaches the station, leaps from his saddle, and immediately mounts a fresh, spirited animal. This process of switching allowed information to travel continuously, day and night, through blizzards, sandstorms, and mountain passes that would have stopped any merchant caravan in its tracks. The scale of the Yam was staggering. At its height, the network comprised tens of thousands of stations, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Eastern Europe. It was an intelligence machine. It allowed the Khan to know of a rebellion in a distant province, a famine in a mountain valley, or the arrival of a foreign dignitary, all while the news was still fresh. It allowed for the rapid mobilization of armies and the seamless flow of tax revenues and imperial decrees. But the Yam was not merely for military intelligence. It was the silent engine of the Pax Mongolica. It provided the security that allowed merchants like the Polos to travel with relative confidence. The same infrastructure that carried the Khan's orders also facilitated the movement of diplomats, scholars, and high-value goods. It was the invisible thread that wove together the disparate cultures of the Silk Road, creating a sense of global connectivity that the world had never before experienced. In an era where information usually moved at the speed of a walking camel, the Yam was a revolution. It was the triumph of organization over geography, proving that even the most formidable landscapes could be conquered by the sheer force of human will and systematic design. Through the Yam, the Mongol Empire didn't just inhabit the Silk Road. It mastered it. 1347 CE. The bustling, salt-scented ports of the Black Sea and the crowded marketplaces of Central Asia. For decades, the Pax Mongolica had promised a world of unprecedented connection. The roads were safe, the stations were full, and the flow of goods was constant. But the very infrastructure that had enabled the glorious expansion of trade was about to become the conduit for humanity's greatest catastrophe. The same veins that carried silk, spices, and gold were about to carry a silent, invisible passenger that no imperial decree could stop. The shadow of death did not arrive with the thunder of Mongol hooves or the clash of steel. It arrived in the bellies of merchant ships and the saddlebags of weary travelers. It was the Yersinia pestis, the bacterium known as the Black Death. As the Mongol Empire's grip on the Silk Road tightened, it inadvertently created a biological superhighway. The rapid movement of the Yam messengers, the relentless pace of the caravans, and the integration of distant markets meant that a pathogen born in the remote steppes of Central Asia or the high plateaus of Asia could traverse continents with terrifying speed. In the past, geography had acted as a natural quarantine. Mountains, vast deserts, and slow travel had given diseases time to burn out in isolation. But the Mongols had conquered geography. They had closed the distance, and in doing so, they had invited the plague to ride alongside the silk. The spread was methodical. It began in the east, creeping through the trade hubs of China and the stepping stones of the Silk Road. From there, it moved westward, hitching a ride on the very caravans that had once brought prosperity. It traveled through the oasis cities of Samarkand and Bukhara, turning bustling centers of learning into silent graveyards. It moved through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, carried by flea-ridden rodents and infected merchants who felt only a slight fever before the end. By the time the plague reached the shores of the Black Sea, it had become a juggernaut. Legend tells us of the siege of Kaffa, where the Mongol forces, struck by the pestilence themselves, allegedly catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, an early, horrific instance of biological warfare. From Kaffa, the plague boarded Genoese ships, sailing into the heart of the Mediterranean, striking at the jugular of Europe. The devastation was absolute. This was not merely a period of high mortality. It was a total collapse of the social and economic order. Entire villages along the Silk Road vanished, reclaimed by the desert sands. The rhythmic pulse of the caravan trade faltered as people fled in terror, spreading the contagion even further in their desperation. The great oasis cities, once the cosmopolitan jewels of the world, became hollowed-out shells. The Black Death did more than kill millions. It severed the connections the Mongols had worked so hard to build. It broke the trust between trading partners and shattered the stability of the Silk Road. The invisible thread that had woven East and West together was now frayed, stained by the blood of a dying population. As the shadows lengthened across the Eurasian landmass, the golden age of exchange began to wither, signaling not just the end of a prosperous era, but the beginning of a dark, fractured age of isolation. 1368 CE. The crumbling battlements of Khanbalik and the splintered courts of the four great Mongol Khanates. If the Black Death was the sudden, violent stroke that paralyzed the Silk Road, then the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire was the slow, agonizing decay that followed. For over a century, the Pax Mongolica had acted as a single, cohesive nervous system for the Eurasian continent. Under the shadow of the great Khans, a merchant could travel from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea with a silver tablet in his hand, protected by a unified legal code and a shared security umbrella. But that umbrella was tearing apart. As the mid-14th century progressed, the dream of a unified steppe empire dissolved into a kaleidoscope of warring factions. The Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in the east were no longer siblings in a grand imperial family. They had become bitter rivals, separated by shifting borders, religious schisms, and relentless civil wars. The consequences for the Silk Road were catastrophic. The safety that had defined the Mongol era evaporated. The once reliable Yam postal stations, which had functioned with the precision of a modern clock, fell into disrepair or were seized by local warlords. The roads that once flowed with the easy movement of ideas and goods were now choked by checkpoints, heavy taxation, and the constant threat of banditry. To travel from Chang'an to Baghdad was no longer a journey of commerce. It was a gauntlet of survival. This political disintegration coincided with a profound shift in the very nature of power. In China, the Ming dynasty rose from the ashes of the Mongol Yuan, turning its gaze away from the chaotic steppes and toward a more inward-looking, defensive posture. In the West, the rise of new, localized powers meant that the grand, transcontinental vision was being replaced by a fractured landscape of small, competing interests. The great oasis cities, once the vibrant, multi-ethnic hearts of the world, began to feel the sting of this isolation. Without the steady, massive influx of wealth provided by the Mongol peace, the infrastructure of the desert began to fail. The sophisticated irrigation systems that kept cities like Merv and Samarkand blooming in the sand required constant maintenance and stability, two things the warring khanates could no longer provide. As the water dried and the trade slowed, the people followed, fleeing to more stable regions or simply vanishing into the annals of history. The Silk Road was not just losing its wealth, it was losing its purpose. The interconnectedness that had turned the world into a single, breathing organism was being severed, limb by limb. The geopolitical maps were being redrawn, not by the expansion of empires, but by their contraction. The great land routes, which had served as the arteries of civilization for a millennium, were becoming clogged and stagnant. The era of the great overland caravans was entering its twilight. The world was becoming smaller in terms of connectivity, even as it grew larger in terms of distance. The bridge between East and West was breaking, leaving behind a trail of ghost cities and silent markets. As we look toward the horizon of the 15th century, a new question begins to emerge from the dust of the dying Silk Road. If the land is no longer safe, if the desert is no longer traversable, where will the world turn to find its connection? May 1453, Constantinople. If the fragmentation of the Mongol Khanates was the slow decay of the Silk Road's nervous system, then the fall of Constantinople was the final, decisive amputation. For over 1,000 years, this city, the queen of cities, had stood as the ultimate gateway. It was the indispensable hinge upon which the door between East and West swung. To control Constantinople was to control the flow of the world's most precious commodities. It was the final destination for the caravans of the East and the starting point for the merchants of the West. But by the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire had been reduced to a mere shadow, a flickering candle in a darkening room. The once mighty empire was now little more than the city itself, surrounded by a rising tide of Ottoman power. For decades, the Ottomans had been tightening their grip on the Anatolian Peninsula and the Balkans, slowly encircling this Christian bastion. Then came the siege. In April of 1453, Sultan Mehmed II, a young and ambitious leader, brought to the walls of Constantinople something the world had never seen: massive, gunpowder-fueled cannons capable of shattering walls that had stood for a millennium. For 53 days, the city endured a relentless bombardment. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and the screams of the dying. Inside the walls, the defenders, led by the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were defending the end of an era. When the walls finally breached on May 29th, the impact was felt far beyond the smoke-filled streets of the city. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks was not merely a military victory, it was a geopolitical earthquake. The gates to the Silk Road were not just closed, they were slammed shut and locked behind a new, formidable power. The Ottomans now held a monopoly over the traditional overland routes. For the European powers, the cost of doing business had just become prohibitive. To reach the spices of India, the silks of China, or the precious stones of the East, Western merchants now had to contend with the heavy taxes, the shifting political whims, and the religious hostilities of the Ottoman Empire. The direct, predictable connection that had sustained Mediterranean trade for centuries was severed. The Silk Road, once a sprawling web of opportunity, had become a labyrinth of obstacles. The traditional arteries of commerce were now blocked by a single, powerful gatekeeper. This created a vacuum of necessity, a desperate, driving hunger in the hearts of Europe to find another way. The fall of the city triggered a profound psychological shift in the West. The Mediterranean, once the center of the known world, suddenly felt like a cul-de-sac. The old maps were becoming obsolete. The blockade of the land routes did not destroy the desire for Eastern luxuries. It merely redirected it. It forced the eyes of Europe away from the dusty, contested paths of the Levant and toward the vast, terrifying, and uncharted blue of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The death of the old Silk Road in the East was, paradoxically, the midwife of a new era in the West. The closing of the gates in Constantinople forced humanity to look toward the horizon, setting the stage for a desperate, high-stakes race to find a way around the world. 1492, the Atlantic coast of Europe. The era of the caravan was dying, but the era of the sail was being born in a fever of desperation and greed. For the monarchs and merchants of Europe, the loss of the overland Silk Road was not just a logistical problem, it was an existential crisis. The luxuries that defined status, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and silk, were still there, pulsing in the markets of the East, but the bridge to reach them had been broken. The solution was a gamble of unprecedented scale. If the gates of the East were locked, then the world itself had to be circumnavigated. This was the dawn of the age of exploration. It was a period defined by a shift in the very geometry of human ambition. No longer were explorers looking to cross the mountains of Central Asia or the deserts of Persia. They were looking to conquer the horizon. The focus of human history was pivoting from the dusty, interconnected heart of Eurasia to the vast, terrifying, and seemingly infinite emptiness of the oceans. Leading this charge were the maritime powers of the Atlantic fringe, Portugal and Spain. These nations, positioned on the literal edge of the known world, had everything to gain and nothing to lose. They invested in new technologies. The caravel, a nimble ship capable of sailing against the wind, the astrolabe, which allowed sailors to navigate by the stars, and more accurate cartography that began to peel back the veil of the unknown. The stakes were nothing less than total economic dominance. The race was on to find a maritime back door to the riches of Asia, bypassing the Ottoman middlemen entirely. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, a man driven by a singular, perhaps flawed vision, set sail westward across the Atlantic. He believed he could reach the east by sailing into the sunset, effectively finding a shortcut that ignored the existence of the Americas. When he made landfall in the Caribbean, he believed he had finally reached the fringes of the Silk Road's end. He had not found the spices of India, but he had stumbled upon a new world that would irrevocably alter the trajectory of human history. But while Columbus was exploring the West, the true bypass of the Silk Road was being forged in the South. In 1498, a Portuguese navigator named Vasco da Gama achieved what many thought was impossible. He did not sail west, he sailed south, hugging the treacherous, storm-swept coast of Africa. He navigated the Cape of Storms, a point of no return where the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean. When da Gama finally emerged into the warm, turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean and reached the Malabar coast of India, the world changed forever. He had done it, he had found the sea route, he had found the bypass. The implications were immediate and devastating for the ancient Silk Road. With the discovery of these oceanic highways, the great overland arteries, the paths carved by camels and nomads through the Taklamakan and the steppes, began to wither. Why endure the bandits, the mountain passes, and the heavy taxes of the Middle East when a single ship could carry 1,000 times the cargo across the open sea? The center of gravity was shifting. The wealth of the world was moving from the heart of the continents to the edges of the oceans. The Silk Road, for millennia the lifeblood of human connection, was being bypassed by the very currents of the sea. The age of exploration had not just discovered new lands, it had effectively rerouted the flow of civilization itself. 1511, the Strait of Malacca. If Vasco da Gama's voyage was the spark, the conquest of the spice choke points was the wildfire. As the Portuguese established their presence in the Indian Ocean, they realized that controlling the Silk Road no longer required controlling the vast, sprawling deserts of Central Asia. It only required controlling the narrow, watery veins that connected the east to the west. The Strait of Malacca, a sliver of water between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, became the most important strategic location on the planet. It was the gateway to the Spice Islands, the legendary Moluccas, where cloves and nutmeg grew in abundance. By seizing this strait, the maritime powers were not just participating in trade, they were placing a chokehold on the very pulse of Asian commerce. This was the birth of thalassocracy, rule by the sea. The power of empires was no longer measured by the number of horses in their cavalry or the breadth of their steppe territories, but by the number of cannons on their decks and the tonnage of their hulls. The great land-based empires of the interior, once the masters of the world's wealth, found themselves increasingly sidelined, becoming peripheral players in a global game played on the high seas. As the 16th century progressed, the monopoly of the Portuguese was challenged by a new, even more formidable breed of entity, the chartered company. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, and the British East India Company arrived not merely as merchants, but as sovereign states in wooden hulls. These were the world's first megacorporations, armed with private armies, the power to wage war, and the mandate to colonize. They brought with them a terrifyingly efficient form of capitalism. Unlike the Sogdian merchants of old, who relied on diplomacy, kinship, and the slow rhythm of the caravan, these companies relied on systematic exploitation and naval supremacy. They built massive stone fortresses in ports like Batavia and Goa, creating a network of maritime hubs that functioned as the new oasis cities. However, these were not melting pots of cultural exchange like Samarkand. They were fortified outposts of extraction. The economic math was undeniable. A single Dutch carrack, heavily laden with pepper and cinnamon, could carry the equivalent of several thousand camel loads. The cost per unit dropped, the speed of delivery increased, and the risks of the overland route, the bandits of the mountains, the shifting sands, and the political whims of desert khans, became irrelevant. The Oceanic Silk Road was faster, larger, and far more profitable, even if it was far more violent. The result was a profound and permanent shift in the global hierarchy. The Great Silk Road cities, the jewels of the Taklamakan and the golden hubs of Transoxiana, began to fall into a long, slow twilight. The caravans grew smaller, the bustling bazaars grew quieter. The wealth that once flowed through the heart of Eurasia was being diverted into the holds of ships, bypassing the Silk Road entirely to feed the growing hunger of Atlantic Europe. The center of the world had moved. The Silk Road, which had for thousands of years acted as the bridge between civilizations, was being dismantled, piece by piece, by the rising tide of the oceans. The age of the desert was ending. The age of the sea had truly begun. 1570. Potosi, the high mountains of the Andes. While the oceans were shifting the direction of trade, a new, invisible force was beginning to surge through the global arteries, one that would ultimately tie the fate of the Americas to the fate of the Chinese emperor. If the previous era was defined by the movement of spices and silks, this new era was defined by a single, lustrous metal: silver. Deep within the mountains of what is now Bolivia, the Spanish had discovered a treasure of apocalyptic proportions. The Cerro Rico, or Rich Hill, was a mountain of silver so vast it seemed to defy the laws of nature. Using a brutal system of forced labor, the Spanish Empire began to extract the mountain's wealth at an unprecedented scale. This was not merely wealth, it was the fuel for a burgeoning global economy. But silver, once extracted, needed a destination. It flowed from the mines of the Andes, across the Atlantic to Seville, and then, through a complex web of European finance and colonial trade, it began its long journey toward the East. Why the East? Because the Ming dynasty had made a fateful decision. Faced with the immense costs of defending their borders and managing a massive bureaucracy, the Chinese government transitioned their entire tax system from grain and labor to silver. Suddenly, the Middle Kingdom had an insatiable hunger for the metal. To the Chinese, silver was not just a commodity, it was the very lifeblood of their state. This created a massive, global economic vacuum. A silver flow was established, a literal river of metal that bypassed the ancient, dusty tracks of the Central Asian steppe and instead raced across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. The primary conduit for this wealth became the Manila galleons. These massive Spanish ships would sail from Acapulco in Mexico, crossing the vast, treacherous Pacific to reach the Philippines. There, in the bustling port of Manila, the world's two greatest economic engines met. On one side, the silver of the Americas, on the other, the silks, porcelains, and tea of China. This was the birth of true globalism. For the first time in human history, a miner in the Andes, a Spanish sailor in the Pacific, and a silk weaver in the Yangtze River Valley were all connected by a single, unbroken chain of commerce. The silver of the New World was being exchanged for the luxuries of the Old World, creating a cycle of trade that was as unstoppable as it was transformative. However, this flow came with a heavy price. The influx of silver into China was so massive that it triggered profound economic instability. It caused massive inflation, disrupting the lives of millions of peasants and destabilizing the very Ming administration that had demanded it. In the Americas, the silver fever led to the devastation of indigenous populations and the creation of an extractive economy that would haunt the continent for centuries. As the 17th century dawned, the silver flow had fundamentally rewritten the rules of power. The wealth that once moved via camel caravan through the heart of Eurasia was now being channeled through the hulls of European ships and the ports of the Pacific. The Silk Road's traditional masters were left watching from the sidelines as the world's wealth was redirected through a new, metallic current, a current that flowed from the mountains of the West to the markets of the East, forever altering the course of human history. 1644, Beijing, the Forbidden City. The silver that had once promised to stabilize the Middle Kingdom had become a poison. As the Ming dynasty collapsed under the weight of inflation, famine, and internal rebellion, the successor to the throne, the Qing dynasty, inherited a world that was more connected, yet more volatile than ever before. The very thing that had fueled the global economy, the relentless flow of foreign silver and the intrusion of maritime powers, was now viewed by the new Manchu rulers not as a blessing, but as a threat to the very soul of China. The era of the Silk Road's vibrant, porous borders was being replaced by a new chilling philosophy: isolationism. To the Qing emperors, the world beyond their borders was a source of chaos. They saw the rapid expansion of European influence in the Philippines, the aggressive arrival of Portuguese and Dutch traders, and the unpredictable nature of maritime commerce as a contagion. They feared that the barbarian ideas, Christianity, foreign political structures, and even the destabilizing effects of foreign wealth would erode the Confucian foundations that held their massive empire together. The response was a slow, deliberate closing of the gates. Through a series of decrees, the Qing began to restrict foreign contact. The Canton system was established, a policy that effectively funneled all Western maritime trade through a single, heavily monitored port, Guangzhou or Canton. Foreigners were no longer permitted to wander the vast interior of China. They could not traverse the old Silk Road paths that once connected Chang'an to the west. They were confined to small, walled-off enclaves, watched by imperial officials and strictly regulated. Trade was no longer an open dialogue between cultures. It was a controlled transaction, a leash held tightly by the emperor. This was more than just a trade policy. It was a psychological withdrawal. As the Qing tightened their grip, the great Silk Road cities of the interior, the once bustling hubs of Samarkand and Dunhuang, began to wither. The caravans that had once carried a kaleidoscope of ideas, religions, and technologies were replaced by the silence of abandoned outposts. The land routes, which had survived for millennia through the strength of nomadic connection and imperial protection, were now being suffocated by a desire for purity and security. While the West was entering the Enlightenment and the early sparks of the Industrial Revolution, China was turning its back on the horizon. The empire sought stability through stillness. They believed that by limiting the world to a single port, they could preserve the sanctity of the Middle Kingdom. But isolation is a double-edged sword. While it provided a temporary sense of order and cultural preservation, it also created a profound disconnect. As China withdrew into itself, the rest of the world continued to accelerate. The oceans were no longer just paths for silver. They were the highways of a new, industrial age. By choosing to sever the ancient, winding veins of the Silk Road in favor of a controlled, singular gate, the Qing dynasty was inadvertently setting the stage for a monumental collision, a clash between a civilization looking inward for strength and a world that was rapidly, uncontrollably, looking outward. 1750, the Taklamakan Desert, Central Asia. Where once the air was thick with the rhythmic tolling of camel bells and the multilingual chatter of 1,000 traders, there is now only the low, mournful whistle of the wind moving through shifting dunes. The great oasis cities, the beating hearts of the Silk Road, are no longer pulsing with life. They are fading. The decline of the overland routes was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, agonizing evaporation. For centuries, these cities, Kashgar, Khatan, Turpan, had thrived on the principle of movement. They were the indispensable way stations of civilization. But as the maritime empires of Europe mastered the monsoon winds and the treacherous currents of the Cape of Good Hope, the logic of the desert began to fail. Why endure the brutal heat, the predatory raids of nomadic tribes, and the grueling months of sand and stone, when a single merchant vessel could carry 10 times the cargo at a fraction of the cost? The Silk Road was being bypassed, not just by ships, but by the very concept of geography itself. As the wealth of the world migrated to the coastlines, the interior of Eurasia began to suffer a profound economic starvation. The great caravanserais, those fortified inns that had once provided sanctuary to weary travelers and their precious silks, began to crumble. The plaster peeled from the walls. The roof beams succumbed to the weight of time. The wells, once meticulously maintained by local authorities, began to choke on silt and sand. Without the constant influx of travelers, there was no revenue to sustain the infrastructure. Without infrastructure, the routes became too dangerous to traverse. And without the routes, the cities died. This was the era of the fading echoes. In the markets of Samarkand, the vibrant colors of Persian dyes and the luster of Chinese porcelain began to dim as the supply lines withered. The intellectual exchange that had once defined this region, the passing of astronomical tables, medical treatises, and philosophical debates, slowly ground to a halt. The Silk Road was more than a commercial artery. It was a neural network for the human race. As the connections severed, the great cities of the steppe were effectively lobotomized, cut off from the collective progress of the global community. The human cost was felt in the quiet disappearance of entire ways of life. The Sogdian-style merchant families, the specialized desert guides, and the nomadic protectors of the routes found themselves obsolete. They were the ghosts of a former age, watching as the world's gaze shifted irrevocably toward the horizon of the sea. As the 18th century drew to a close, the Silk Road had transitioned from a highway of progress to a graveyard of ambitions. The once mighty arteries of trade were becoming nothing more than scars on the face of the earth, visible only to the most intrepid travelers or the most determined archaeologists. The great experiment of transcontinental connection, which had shaped the destiny of empires from Rome to Chang'an, was entering its twilight. The world was growing smaller through the sea, but for the heart of Asia, the world was becoming vast, silent, and impossibly distant. The echoes were fading, leaving behind only the dust of what had once been the center of the world. 1890. The edge of the Taklamakan Desert, Central Asia. For centuries, the Silk Road had been a phantom, a memory buried under hundreds of feet of shifting, golden sand. To the modern world of the late 19th century, these routes were nothing more than legends whispered by Bedouin guides, tales of lost kingdoms and golden cities that had long since surrendered to the desert's hunger. But beneath the silence of the dunes, the history of humanity was waiting to be exhaled. The era of the fading echoes was coming to a close, not through the return of trade, but through the relentless curiosity of the scientific age. As the geopolitical interests of the great powers began to shift toward the heart of Asia, a new kind of traveler arrived. They did not come with spice, silk, or gold. They came with transit levels, fine brushes, and notebooks. They were the archaeologists. The revival began as a series of frantic, often controversial races. Explorers like Oral Stein, Albert von Lecoq, and Paul Pelliot ventured into the most inhospitable reaches of the Tarim Basin. They were looking for more than just treasure. They were looking for the missing links of human civilization. And what they found shattered the perception that the Silk Road had been a series of isolated pockets of culture. Instead, they found a seamless, interconnected web of human genius. In the caves of Dunhuang, the discovery of the Magao caves sent shockwaves through the academic world. Beneath the dust of a millennium lay a breathtaking library of manuscripts, texts in Sanskrit, Tibetan, Sogdian, and Old Turkic. These were not just religious sutras. They were receipts for grain, legal contracts, and personal letters. They provided a heartbeat to the past, proving that the Silk Road was not just a corridor for kings, but a bustling ecosystem of everyday people. In the ruins of Nia and Lulan, archaeologists unearthed the tangible remains of a lost world. They pulled intact fragments of silk from the dry earth, preserved by the desert's thirst. They found Greco-Buddhist statuettes, where the flowing robes of a Greek Apollo merged with the meditative stillness of an Indian Buddha, the ultimate physical evidence of the Silk Road's greatest achievement, the fusion of East and West. However, this revival was a double-edged sword. As these treasures were unearthed, they became pawns in a new kind of imperial game. Many of the most significant artifacts were spirited away to the museums of London, Berlin, and Paris, creating a fractured legacy that continues to spark debates over cultural repatriation to this day. The revival was, in many ways, a colonial excavation, where the history of the East was being reconstructed through the lenses of the West. Yet, despite the complexities of how these items were found, the impact was undeniable. The archaeological revival transformed the Silk Road from a myth into a measurable scientific reality. It proved that the desert was not a barrier but a bridge. It showed that even when the caravan stopped moving and the cities fell silent, the ideas they carried, the religions, the technologies, and the art, had already been woven into the very fabric of global civilization. The dust was finally being brushed away, revealing that the Silk Road had never truly died. It had simply been waiting to be remembered. 1900. The iron arteries of Eurasia, spanning from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific coast. For a millennium, the pulse of the Silk Road was measured by the rhythmic, heavy footfalls of camels and the slow, seasonal trek of the caravan. It was a movement dictated by the endurance of flesh and bone, by the availability of water, and by the whims of the wind. But as the 20th century dawned, a new, much more violent rhythm began to drown out the silence of the desert, the relentless, mechanical scream of the steam engine. The Industrial Revolution, which had once seemed a distant phenomenon confined to the factories of Europe, had finally arrived to reclaim the ancient roots. The era of the archaeologist had unearthed the past. Now, the era of the engineer would reshape the future. The new Silk Road was being forged not in the minds of poets or the hands of silk weavers, but in the soot-stained hands of steelworkers and the blueprints of imperial planners. The most profound shift came with the arrival of the railway. Across the vast, unforgiving stretches of Central Asia, steel rails were being laid with a speed that would have seemed miraculous to a Tang dynasty merchant. Where a caravan might take months to traverse the distance between two oasis cities, the locomotive could do it in days. The tyranny of distance, which had defined the Silk Road for 2,000 years, was being dismantled. The slow, delicate exchange of goods was replaced by the mass movement of raw materials: coal, iron, timber, and grain. The Silk Road was no longer just a corridor for luxuries. It was becoming a heavy-duty industrial spine for the continent. This was more than just a change in speed. It was a fundamental change in the geography of power. The great oasis cities, Samarkand, Kashgar, Dunhuang, which had once thrived as vital way stations for travelers, found themselves bypassed by the straight, unyielding lines of the tracks. The lifeblood of the old routes was being diverted. New cities began to rise around railway junctions, while the ancient hubs, once the beating hearts of trade, began to wither in the shadows of the steam whistle. The desert was being conquered, not by the grit of the traveler, but by the sheer, unblinking force of industrial logistics. As the rails spread, so too did the wires. The telegraph followed the tracks, stitching the distant corners of Eurasia together with a web of copper. For the first time in human history, information could travel faster than a galloping horse. The Silk Road was becoming wired. The merchant in London could now know the price of silk in Shanghai almost in real time. The world was shrinking. The isolation that had allowed many of these ancient cultures to develop their unique identities was being eroded by a sudden, overwhelming connectivity. Yet this industrial transformation was never neutral. It was driven by the geopolitical ambitions of empires: the British, the Russian, and the Qing, all racing to claim the strategic depth of the interior. The railway was a tool of empire as much as it was a tool of trade. It brought stability and commerce, but it also brought the capacity for rapid military mobilization and the extraction of resources on an unprecedented scale. As the steam engines roared across the steppe, the Silk Road underwent its most radical metamorphosis. The ancient, organic network of paths and oases was being overwritten by a rigid mechanical grid. The era of the camel had ended. The era of the machine had begun. The bridge between east and west was no longer made of silk and sand, but of steel and electricity. 1947. The divided landscapes of Eurasia. If the steam engine had shrunk the world, the mid-20th century threatened to tear it apart. For 2 millennia, the Silk Road had functioned as a circulatory system, a continuous flowing loop of exchange that ignored the arbitrary lines of kings and emperors. But as the smoke of the Second World War cleared, a new, darker shadow fell across the steppes: the Iron Curtain. The Silk Road, once a bridge, was suddenly being transformed into a barricade. The geopolitical earthquake of the Cold War did not just redraw maps, it severed the very arteries of transcontinental connection. The ancient routes, which had once facilitated the seamless movement of ideas from the Mediterranean to the Yellow Sea, were now sliced into ideological fragments. To the west lay the democratic bloc, and to the east, the communist sphere. In between lay the buffer states of Central Asia, lands that had once been the vibrant, cosmopolitan heart of the world, but were now becoming the high-stakes chessboard of superpowers. Suddenly, the railway lines that had so efficiently conquered distance were being used to enforce isolation. Borders that were once porous, where merchants might pass with little more than a nod to a local chieftain, were now fortified with barbed wire, minefields, and watchful sentries. The wired world of the telegraph was no longer used to synchronize the price of silk, but to transmit the commands of generals and the frantic warnings of intelligence agencies. In the vast expanses of the Fergana Valley, the Pamir Mountains, and the deserts of Xinjiang, the geography of trade was replaced by the geography of containment. The Silk Road was being partitioned. A merchant could no longer simply travel from Samarkand to Xi'an. He now had to navigate a labyrinth of closed frontiers, ideological checkpoints, and suspicious bureaucracies. The fluid movement of culture, the very essence of the Silk Road, was frozen in place. This era saw the rise of closed corridors. The Soviet Union's vast interior became a fortress, a massive, landlocked bastion that looked inward, prioritizing military security over commercial fluidity. Meanwhile, China, following its own revolutionary path, turned its back on the traditional routes to the West, focusing on internal consolidation and a different kind of connectivity. The ancient oasis cities, which had survived the rise and fall of empires, now faced a new kind of death, the death of relevance. When a route is blocked by ideology, the cities along it do not just lose profit, they lose their purpose. The Silk Road was no longer a highway. It was a series of disconnected islands. The grand, sweeping continuity of Eurasia was broken into a patchwork of permitted and forbidden zones. The connectivity that the industrial age had promised was being systematically dismantled by the logic of the standoff. Yet, even as the borders hardened, the spirit of the route could not be entirely extinguished. Beneath the surface of the Cold War standoff, the ghost of the Silk Road remained, a memory of a time when the world was one, and a latent potential for a future where those borders might once again be crossed. The steel rails remained, and the wires still hummed, waiting for a time when the world would once again seek to bridge the gap. 2013, Beijing, China. For decades, the ghost of the Silk Road had lived in the shadow of the Cold War's partitions. The great arteries of Eurasia had remained largely dormant, serving more as military corridors or isolated national backbones than as a singular, pulsing network of global exchange. But as the new millennium dawned, the geopolitical tectonic plates began to shift. The era of containment was giving way to an era of unprecedented connectivity, and at the center of this shift sat a vision that sought to do more than just rebuild trade routes. It sought to rewire the very skeleton of the world. This was the birth of the Belt and Road Initiative. Announced by President Xi Jinping, the initiative was a grand, multi-trillion-dollar reimagining of the ancient world. It was not merely a series of construction projects. It was a geopolitical masterstroke designed to resurrect the spirit of the Silk Road for the age of high-speed rail, massive container ships, and fiber-optic cables. The strategy was split into two distinct realms: the Silk Road Economic Belt, a network of overland corridors stretching from the Chinese heartland through Central Asia to Europe, and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, a sea route connecting China's coasts to Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. Where the old Silk Road relied on the slow, rhythmic pace of the camel caravan, the new Silk Road was built on the velocity of the 21st century. It was a blueprint of mega infrastructure, deep-water ports in Djibouti, high-speed railways cutting through the mountains of Laos, and massive pipelines snaking across the Kazakh steppe. The goal was to overcome the very geography of containment that had defined the previous century. By investing in the landlocked nations of Central Asia, China was effectively turning them back into land-linked hubs, reintegrating the fractured buffer states of the Cold War into a new, coherent economic engine. But a project of this magnitude does not arrive without friction. As the cranes rose and the concrete poured, a new kind of debate emerged, one that moved from the battlefields of history to the halls of international diplomacy and finance. Critics pointed to debt-trap diplomacy, warning that the massive loans used to fund these projects could grant Beijing unprecedented leverage over the sovereignty of developing nations. They saw a new era of influence, where economic dependency could become a more powerful tool than any standing army. Yet, for the proponents, the vision was clear. It was a way to bridge the developmental gap between the global North and South, creating a more multipolar world where prosperity flowed through once-neglected corridors. It was an attempt to erase the scars of the 20th century's divisions and replace them with a web of mutual interest. As we look at the maps of the modern era, the lines are being drawn once again. But this time, they are not being drawn by the barbed wire of ideological frontiers, but by the tracks of locomotives and the undersea cables of a digital age. The Silk Road is no longer a memory. It is a living, breathing, and deeply contested reality, proving that the ancient desire to connect the ends of the earth remains the most powerful force in human history. 2024, Shenzhen, China. If the Belt and Road Initiative provided the physical skeleton of the new Silk Road, the steel rails, the concrete ports, and the asphalt arteries, then the digital Silk Road is its nervous system. We have entered an era where the most valuable cargo moving across Eurasia is no longer silk, spices, or silver, but something far more ephemeral, yet infinitely more powerful: data. As the physical infrastructure of the 21st century took shape, a second, invisible revolution began to unfold beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean and beneath the sands of the Gobi Desert. This is the story of the digital frontier, a massive, high-speed expansion of fiber-optic cables, satellite constellations, and 5G networks that is effectively remapping the world's information highways. In the ancient world, a merchant's success depended on knowing the mountain passes and the water holes. Today, a nation's prosperity depends on its latency, its bandwidth, and its position within the global data stream. The digital Silk Road represents a concerted effort to build a seamless technological corridor that connects the digital economies of the East with the markets of the West and the developing nations of the global South. This digital expansion is not merely about faster internet. It is about the fundamental architecture of modern life. It involves the laying of undersea cables that act as the high-speed conduits for the world's financial transactions. It involves the deployment of smart city technologies in African hubs and Middle Eastern metropolises, powered by Chinese algorithms and hardware. It involves the integration of satellite navigation systems that provide the precision required for autonomous shipping and global logistics. But where the old Silk Road was a path for cultural exchange, the digital Silk Road is a conduit for technological standards. As digital infrastructure is laid, the rules of the road are being written in code. The nation that provides the hardware, the routers, the towers, the chips, effectively sets the protocols for how information is moved, stored, and governed. This has ignited a new kind of great game, a digital struggle for technological sovereignty. The implications are profound. For many developing nations, this digital influx offers a leapfrog opportunity, the chance to bypass the slow build-out of traditional copper wire telephony and jump straight into a mobile-first, high-speed future. It brings e-commerce to remote villages and digital banking to the unbanked, mirroring the way the ancient oasis cities once brought sudden, transformative wealth to the desert. However, this digital connectivity brings with it new, invisible risks. The same cables that carry commerce also carry the potential for unprecedented surveillance and data interception. The debate has shifted from the sovereignty of land to the sovereignty of the cloud. As data flows across borders, questions of privacy, cybersecurity, and the control of information have become the new battlegrounds of international relations. As we stand at this intersection of the physical and the virtual, we see that the Silk Road has undergone its most radical transformation yet. The caravans have been replaced by packets of data. The oasis cities are now data centers, and the desert sands now hide a web of glass fibers. The ancient impulse to connect remains the same, but the medium has changed. We are no longer just trading goods. We are trading the very intelligence that defines our modern existence, weaving a digital tapestry that may one day bind the world together, or divide it more deeply than ever before. 2024, Samarkand, Uzbekistan. The echoes of the past are never truly silent. They reside in the geometry of a mosaic, the spice in a marketplace, and the restless human drive to reach beyond the horizon. As we conclude our journey through the centuries, we must ask ourselves, what ultimately is the Silk Road? Is it a set of dusty tracks through the Taklamakan, a collection of maritime routes across the Indian Ocean, or is it something more profound? The Silk Road was never merely a trade route. It was the world's first great experiment in human interconnectedness. It was the realization that no civilization is an island. From the first jade carvings moving through the steppes to the lightning-fast fiber optics of the modern age, the story of the Silk Road is the story of the human species attempting to bridge the gap between the self and the other. History shows us that when we connect, we transform. We saw it when Buddhism traveled from the Ganges to the Yellow River, reshaping the spiritual landscape of East Asia. We saw it when the secret of paper moved from Chinese workshops to the libraries of Baghdad, sparking an intellectual explosion that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. We saw it when the Mongol peace allowed a traveler like Marco Polo to carry the wonders of the East back to a skeptical Europe. Each connection brought a gift, but each connection also brought a challenge. The same roots that carried silk also carried the Black Death. The same paths that brought prosperity also brought the friction of conquest and the scars of war. This tension is the eternal heartbeat of the Silk Road. It teaches us that globalization is not a new phenomenon, nor is it a purely benevolent one. It is a volatile, beautiful, and dangerous process of integration. It is a process that forces us to confront our differences even as it encourages us to share our greatest achievements. Today, as we look at the sprawling megacities of the 21st century and the invisible webs of the digital frontier, we see the Silk Road reborn in every transaction, every cultural exchange, and every technological breakthrough. The caravans may have vanished, and the camel bells may have fallen silent, but the impulse remains unchanged. We are still those same ancient merchants, still those same explorers, driven by a fundamental necessity to know what lies on the other side of the mountain, across the sea, or behind the digital firewall. The Silk Road's legacy is the realization that our destinies are inextricably linked. We live in an era of unprecedented connectivity, where a disruption in one corner of the globe vibrates through the entire system. We are more entwined than ever before, economically, technologically, and culturally. As this documentary draws to a close, look not just at the maps of the past, but at the world of today. The Silk Road is not a finished chapter in a history book. It is an ongoing dialogue. It is a living, breathing, evolving tapestry of human ambition. It is the enduring truth that despite our borders, our languages, and our ideologies, we are all travelers on the same long, winding road, searching for connection in a vast and complex world.